Now let's continue with this analysis. What we have here is to make a comparison between two workers to understand their hours of work over the life cycle. And here we talk about two workers with different wage path. There are two workers and their names are Joe and Jack. Joe's wage is always higher than Jack's wage over the life cycle. So in this age earning profile diagrams, we find that the age earning profile for Joe is higher than the age earning profile for Jack. In terms of their work hours, both work more hours when the wage is high. The idea of evolutionary wage, where we see the relationship between hours work and the level of wage rate, still true between the two workers. In this case, when the wage starts to go higher for both workers, they also then would work more hours. However, when we make a comparison between two workers, and over here, notice that Joe may work more hours as indicated by this higher curve, and there is a possibility that Joe may work less hours than Jack as indicated by this curve. What explains the situation here depends on whether Joe's substitution effect dominates his income effect, where if that's the case, Joe therefore will work more than Jack. But if Joe's income effect dominates his substitution effect, Joe therefore will work less than Jack. So don't confuse with my earlier conclusion. Over here, we look at the net effects between substitution and income effects only when we make a comparison across workers or between workers, in this case, Joe and Jack. So over the life cycle, if we find that Joe is someone who's always earned more than Jack, but Joe's tend to work more hours than Jack, that could mean that Joe's substitution effect dominates. But if Joe tends to work less hour than Jack, that could mean that Joe's income effect dominates his substitution effect. That's one thing we find in this analysis. Over here, we want to understand the effect of the life cycle model and labor force participation rate. What is labor force participation rate? Labor force participation rate is given by the level of labor force in the economy divided by the number of working age population. Labor force involve those aged 16 years and above, employed and unemployed, and if they are unemployed, they should be actively seeking job. Those are the definition of labor force. And then to calculate the labor force participation rate, we divide labor force over the working age population. We don't divide by the entire population. Usually the working age population starts from the age of 16 and above. So we have discussed earlier about the concept of reservation wage and market wage. If we assume that the reservation wage is constant over time, a worker would only enter the labor market when the wage rate is more than the reservation wage. Therefore, the participation rate is low for young workers, high for prime workers or middle workers, and low for those who near their retirement age. To understand that statement, let's revisit this diagram, and let's say we draw this horizontal line to indicate the level of the reservation wage, WR. And because we assume that WR should be constant over the life cycle. And notice that if we consider WR to be the reservation wage, when the worker is young, indicated from this age up until this point, this worker would not enter the job market because any wage below the reservation wage, the worker will not join the job market. And this is what happened for many young workers. Young workers tend to be unemployed, and that's also not surprising to find that youth unemployment rate tend to be higher because for them, for the workers, they may have higher reservation wage, or another possibility is given the much lower wage rate, the price of leisure for the young workers are cheaper, so they can afford to enjoy more time for leisure. However, when the worker is in the middle age, the worker starts to work more hours because the wage rate then starts to be more than the reservation wage. And from this understanding, we find that the labor force participation rate for young workers tend to be low and much higher for the middle-aged workers and slightly lower compared to the middle workers for the near retirement workers. Apart from the earlier assumption that we make, where we say that reservation wage is constant. However, notice that reservation wage also may vary over time. For example, for a person with a small children or with a big family, there are many factors that would affect the level of reservation wage for a worker. And what I have discussed here is the relationship between the life cycle model and the labor force participation rate of a worker. In this diagram, we find the labor force participation rate over the life cycle in 2010. And here we have for male and for female, and this is the case of a United States. The vertical line measure the labor force participation rate, and the horizontal line measures the age level. Here we find that those below 25 years old, from 16 to 25 years old, we find that they have slightly lower labor force participation rate as compared to those age 25 and above, at least until the age of 55, because these are prime age of workers. However, when they get older, beyond 55, labor force participation rate for the age group 55 years and above starts to decline. So over here we find the relationship between life cycle and the labor force participation rate. One way to estimate the life cycle model is we need to have a longitudinal data, because this may involve following one cohort of workers or group of workers over few periods. And in this model, we find the expression to do the estimation. H here is the hours work for I worker, I to indicate the individual workers, and T is the time period that we observe for these particular workers. Again, over here, we want to estimate alpha 1 here. W is the wage rate for the ith worker over the T period, plus the summation of beta times X, where beta ranges from 1 up until case of beta. That means beta can be beta 1, beta 2, beta 3 up until beta K. And then we also needs to consider many other important variables that may explain hours work over the life cycle. So X are the key variables, and this is the error term. So this is one model that we can use to estimate the life cycle model. Definitely, there are many issues that you will encounter when you estimate this model. I have done a few research in using this model. This model is called the mean Syrian earning function, popularized by Jacob Mincer. Very quickly, if you have a panel or longitudinal data like this, let's say you have variables such as the hours work. To represent a panel data, let's say you have your spreadsheet, and let's say I is for the workers. So let's say this is I, all right? So this is the first worker that you observe, and you will observe this worker for certain periods of time. For a longitudinal data, at least you need 2 periods of observation or more is better. Let's say you observe this worker for year one. Let's say year one is in 2015, where in 2015, this worker works for 40 hours per week. This in 2015. And then you make another observation of the same worker in 2020, where now in 2020, he only works for 30 hours. So over here, we have an example of a longitudinal data or panel data. You make an observation of ICE worker, worker 1, involving certain number of periods, where here the minimum period that we observe for 2 periods, 2015 where he works for 40 hours and 2020 he works now for 30 hours. So this is one observation. The same then needed for other variables. Let's say for the first worker, you need to know how much he earns or how much is his wage rate in 2015. Let's say we are using wage rate per week, and he earns, let's say, $400 per week in 2015, and in 2020 he earns $500 per week. So this is another observation for the second variable. And then you need also to have the same observation for other variables. And this is only for the first worker. And if we have more room, I can show you. For the second worker, then you also need to find how many hours he worked in 2015 and how many hours he worked in 2020, and how much he earned in 2015, how much he earns in 2020, and so on. So this is how the data is presented when we have a longitudinal data. Especially, we use this to estimate the mean Syrian earning function. And again, I would say it is better for you to log your variable. That would normalize many measurement issues. So what we can say here, some conclusion about a life cycle model. A person works fewer hours in the life cycle when the wage rate is low, and the person would work more hours when the wage rate is high. Number two, age earning profile suggests that for the young workers, wage is relatively low, higher for prime workers, and slightly lower when the worker near his or her retirement age. Number three, profile of hours of work over the life cycle is similar to the age earning profile, because age earning profile would show you the relationship between wage rate and age. And the last conclusion we derive in this analysis is that intertemporal substitution hypothesis suggests that people allocate their time over the life cycle so as to take advantage of changes in the price of leisure. What this statement means is that, as we have observed earlier, how people would adjust by allocating their time between work and leisure over the life cycle. And this depends very much on the price of leisure, that is the wage rate. Here we want to understand the relationship between labor supply over the business cycle. When we say the business cycle, this is about the fluctuation in the economy, where there are four phases of business cycle, where a business cycle can look like this. So over here, this can be time, and we can consider this to be economic growth. And when the economy is growing, this can be a period of recovery from the previous low. It starts to pick up until it get to the peak, the highest point of the growth, achieved by the economy, and then there is slowing down of the economy, and this is the period of recession until we get to the bottom of the recession. This is also known as trough, and then rebounds, where we again will have recovery period. So here we want to understand how the labor supply would adjust over the business cycle. There are two major effects that we want to see. When we consider the business cycle, there is a segment of workers called the discouraged worker effect. These are the unemployed workers who would find it is very difficult to find jobs during a period of recession. So they give up searching for work. So when they give up searching for work, they are no longer in the labor force. And this happened in the period of a recession along this line when the economic growth is declining. They give up, and this is what we call the discouraged worker effect. So what happened? The discouraged workers would exit the labor force during the bad economic times. And as a consequence, the labor force participation rate of discouraged workers is pro-cyclical. It go along the cycle of the economy. It is therefore known as a pro-cyclical. As a consequence of the discouraged worker effect, also we say that the overall labor supply in the economy would shrink due to the discouraged worker effect. Another category of workers that would appear during a period of recession is what we call the added worker effect. This added worker effect are those whom, due to the economic pressure, would start joining the labor market. One example of this group of worker is housewives who then would decide from not being in the job market, and because of the recession and the breadwinner in the family, like her husband no longer being employed, she then would find jobs and therefore be part of the labor force. This is what we call the added worker effect. The added worker effect, on the other hand, is counter cyclical to the economy. And we need to consider both effects. The discouraged worker effect usually tends to dominate the added worker effect. What this means is that when there is a recession, many workers, most of them would be discouraged workers. They will stop looking for work, and that creates the discouraged worker effect. This become the big pool as a result of the recession. The added worker effect, on the other hand, would only come from a small proportion of from the working age population, like a group of housewives. Maybe some proportion of them start to becoming active looking for jobs. Therefore, in many cases, the discouraged worker effects tend to dominate the added worker effect. And as a consequence of the two effects, the labor force participation rate is in general tend to be pro-cyclical over the business cycle. I think that's all for this chapter. I hope you can read the remaining parts of the discussion in the textbook, such as the relationship between labor supply and retirement. But the main components of the discussions I have covered for this chapter. After this, we will go to the next chapter, that is to discuss about the labor demand. See you then. Wassalam.